So what is the NEI? The NEI is a national emissions dataset compiled and maintained by EPA. The NEI stands for the National Emissions Inventory. The NEI covers all areas of the U.S. It is a national database of air emissions information with input from state, local, and tribal air pollution control agencies. EPA also does some emission estimates and submits them, and they also gather data from some sources that go into the NEI, such as airport emissions. There are several uses for NEI data, which include air dispersion modeling, regional strategy development, setting regulations, risk assessments, and tracking trends in emissions over time. So if anyone's looking for emissions data, the NEI is where they go. Next, we're going to talk about some differences between the EIS and the NEI. So the EIS, which stands for the Emissions Inventory System, is the actual database which holds the emissions data, and that data is used to create the NEI. The EIS can contain annual, monthly, or daily emissions for sources. To see the EIS data, you have to register for an EIS Gateway account, and then you get a username and a password, and you can download data from the EIS Gateway site. This is where the data that we gave you to import into your TEISS projects came from, is the EIS Gateway system. In contrast, the National Emissions Inventory is a specific year snapshot in time of emissions data received. So if you're looking at the 2011 NEI data, that's only the data from 2011, whereas the EIS system has data from all the years in that inventory included. The NEI data are shared with the public, so EPA compiles the data and distributes it to the public via their website, and that website is not password protected. It's always on an annual reporting cycle for large sources. For smaller sources, it's on a 3-year reporting cycle. So for non-point sources, non-road sources, and on-road sources, it's on a 3-year reporting cycle. So the most current of that triannual inventory is the 2011 data, and that's the data that you're going to be importing into your TEISS project. So next we're going to talk about how the NEI was created. And the state, local, tribal data submitted has priority in the EPA selection of what to include in the NEI. In most cases, EPA estimates are only used in the NEI if data are missing from the state, local, tribal data file. So in these cases, EPA augments the data for the NEI general purpose release data, the GPR data. And the GPR data is what we provide you to import into your TEISS project. An example of this is that if a state data file includes PM10 emissions, but not PM2.5, EPA estimates the PM2.5 emissions based on the PM10 emissions and adds those emissions to the NEI GPR data. Another example is that if a state data file does not contain certain non-point sources, for example, residential heating emissions, EPA estimates those emissions based on default activity data, like perhaps they get from a federal website, and adds those emissions to the NEI GPR data. Next, we'll talk about who has access to EIS and NEI. So, state, local, tribal users of the EIS gateway, meaning they have an account, a username, and a password, have access to their data and any national public releases, such as the GPR data. But a state cannot access a tribe's data, or perhaps another state's data file, unless the state's authorize, or the tribe authorizes that state to access that account. So if you wanted to get NEI data, you could ask the state to give you authorization for you to get that data, and you could work with EPA to do that. The general public does not have access to the NEI data until the data are released on a public website. So next we're going to talk about two different types of NEI data that we have already touched on. These are two types of data sets that you can import into your TEISS project to see the county level emissions. The first is the state data files. Now these are the data files that the state submitted to the NEI. In order to access these files, you need to first register for an EIS gateway account. Then you need to work with EPA, and the contact we have there is Sally Dombrowski, and she can help you establish an agreement with the state agency to access their data. And most state agencies that we've worked with, they don't have any problems sharing their data with the tribes. But some states want the tribe to share their data with them also before they give them access to their data. The state data files are already in the EIS XML format, and that's the format they need to be to import into TEISS. The second set of data files is the GPR data files, and that stands for the General Purpose Release. And these files are a compilation of data submitted to the NEI by the state agency and the local agencies, and it also includes the EPA-estimated data. So if you have an EIS gateway account, since this is a public release by EPA, you can access that GPR data. However, it's not in a format that can be imported into TEISS directly. So what we did was we developed a database that can make that conversion. So the data that we're giving you to import into your TEISS project is the GPR data converted to the EIS XML format for importing into TEISS. In the next few slides, we'll discuss the difference between these two data sets, and although we're using the GPR data for this training, if you want to use the state data files in the future, we'll give you some insight into that. So state data files is the first one we'll talk about. And there are advantages and disadvantages to using both of the types of data sets. So for the state data file, one advantage is that once you have established the sharing agreement with the state agency, the data are accessible anytime. So you can just log into the system and download the most recent updated files. And that means that when the data are updated, you have ready access to that data. Another advantage to the state agency data is that if the optional fields are filled in, and we talked about optional fields a little bit already, and one example is the emission unit description. If that information is filled in by the state agency, you get that information imported into your TEISS project, and in the GPR data that might not necessarily be the case. And having that additional information imported into TEISS might give you more insight about the emissions data. One disadvantage of the state data is that it might not be as complete as the GPR data. So because the state data doesn't include any emissions estimates from EPA, there might be some data in the GPR that's not in the state data files. An example of this is airport emissions. So EPA estimates emissions for airports, and most agencies accept these emissions rather than calculating their own airport emissions. So if there are airports in your area, it is likely that the airport emissions are not in the state data files. And this is also true for any non-point sources that the state elected to use EPA estimates for instead of calculating their own emissions. So, for example, if in your area there are county agencies responsible for submitting NEI data to the EPA, the state files might be lacking data for certain counties. If you wanted to include data for that county in your TEISS project, you would have to work with EPA to establish a sharing relationship with that county to obtain that data. So you might need to have multiple sharing relationships to get all the data that you need. And then you would have to import multiple data files into TEISS. Okay, so we've already talked about, whoops, I skipped a slide there. GPR data. We've already talked a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages just by talking about the EIS state data files. So one advantage to the GPR data is its complete data, including the EPA estimates. It's a one-stop shop, and there's only going to be one file per data category, meaning one point source file, one non-point source file, one on-road source file, one non-road source file to import. One of the disadvantages to the GPR data is that it might not include data in some of the optional fields. So if a state agency entered data into the optional fields, it might not be in the GPR data because EPA compiled that data, and those fields might not have got compiled into it. So just to recap, today we are going to import GPR data, and if you want the state submitted data instead, you need to set up an EIS gateway account and work with Sally Dobrowski to establish a sharing relationship with the state agencies. So this slide is an overview of how to import the GPR data into TEISS. So when you first get the files from the download site, they're zipped files, and what you'll need to do is extract or unzip the files into a folder on your computer that you set up for the training. Then what you're going to do is you're going to open up TEISS, the project you started in Module 3. And to do this, first you open up TEISS, then you click on the file, and then you click on File, and you'll see the most recent project listed in the pick list. And if you don't see those files listed, you need to look at your TEISS notebook for the name that you chose for that project and where you stored that project on your computer. So after you have opened this project, from the TEISS menu, you're going to select NEI and then select Import from EIS XML as shown on this slide. And this is going to be demoed after these slides, so don't worry if you're not catching all of this. So after you click on the Import EIS XML option, this is the window you'll see that's shown. So there's different tabs in this window to allow you to import the data for the different categories, such as point, non-point, non-road, on-road. And we start with the point data just to show you how that looks. For important things to note about the point data is that if you were importing state data files, you have to import 2 different files. That includes the facility inventory file, and that file just has information about emission units, emission process. It doesn't have any of the actual emissions. And then you would need to import the point emission file that contains the actual emissions. And we're just telling you this in case you want to import state data files sometime in the future, but for the GPR data that we're going to import for this training, there is only one point source file that you have to import. And this just gives you a rundown of how you're going to import that file. So the first step is to check the import point sources box, which is right here. Then you want to use this button that looks like a folder to browse or navigate to where you saved the unzipped point data file. You want to click on the Check Selected Locations button because that allows you to import only one county of the file instead of all the counties included in the file. And this is really important because if you imported all locations, it might take TEISS a long time to do the import. And if you want to do other things on your computer at the same time, those things tend to run slowly, and that can lead to some frustration. So you want to make sure you import only a few counties at a time. And I would suggest not importing more than 2 or 3 counties at a time. Unless you have time, like you're going to lunch and you want to let your computer work, then you can import more counties. But as a general rule, I would not import more than 3 counties at a time. And if you have a county that has an urban center, a city, for example, there is a huge possibility that there is a lot of point sources because cities tend to have lots of point sources. So that might take a lot of time to import that file. So we talked about this. It might take 10 or more minutes depending on your file size and how many counties you're going to import. And as I've said, we recommend not importing more than 3 counties at a time, and do not select all location under import options. When TEISS is done importing, you'll get the import successfully completed screen, and that should make you happy because you're done importing data. And you just have to click OK on that. And to import other data, you would just use the other tabs. And you can even import the data concurrently, so while you're importing point data, if you just click on the non-point tab, you can also import that at the same time. If you have a lot of counties you're importing, I would suggest not doing that. I would just do one tab at a time. But the process is similar for each of these data types. And now we are going to show you exactly what we mean by demonstrating how to import the NEI GPR data.